The dust from the auction block swirled in the stifling heat as Madeline Evans clutched her swollen belly, tears streaming down her face. She had just $6 to her name, not nearly enough to buy back her late husband's pocket watch, the only keepsake she had left of him. The crowd's laughter cut through her like a knife as she fumbled with her worn coin purse, her fingers trembling as much as her resolve. Montana Territory, 1878. Summer had settled over the small town of Willow Creek, like a heavy wool blanket, bringing with it the kind of heat that made tempers flare and mercy wither. The town square had transformed into an impromptu auction site, with the late banker's possessions laid out for public bidding. Among them, a gold pocket watch that Madeline recognized instantly, the one her husband Thomas had pawned just before his death in the mine collapse 4 months prior. $6, she called out, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. The auctioneer, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, paused and squinted in her direction. "Did I hear $6 from the widow?" He made a show of cupping his hand to his ear, encouraging the onlookers to turn and stare. "Look at her belly," someone whispered loudly. "She's got no business at an auction." "$6.50, shouted another voice, followed by cruel laughter. $7, called another, clearly taking sport in her distress. Madeline's hand fluttered protectively over her 8-month belly as she blinked back fresh tears. The child within her kicked, as if sensing her distress. $7 going once, the auctioneer called, his gavel poised. $8, Madeline cried desperately, knowing she was offering money she didn't have. The crowd's laughter grew louder. Someone in the back row made a crude remark about pregnant women being too emotional. Madeline's cheeks burned with humiliation as more tears fell. "Look at her crying over a watch," sneered a woman in a fine dress, "as if tears will feed that baby." $8 going once, the auctioneer continued, clearly enjoying the spectacle. $100. The crowd fell silent, heads turning toward the deep voice that had cut through the mockery. At the edge of the gathering stood a tall figure, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him like water around a stone. Maxwell Miller was not a man people crossed in Willow Creek. Known for his quiet demeanor and exceptional skill with horses, he ran the successful Ranch just outside of town. He rarely came into Willow Creek unless necessary, preferring the company of his horses and ranch hands to town gossip. $100 for the watch, he repeated, his voice carrying easily across the now silent square. The auctioneer blinked rapidly, his gavel suspended in midair. $100 from Mr. Miller, he stammered. Going once, going twice. Sold. Maxwell paid no mind to the stunned whispers as he approached the auctioneer's table and counted out the bills. He took the pocket watch, turning it over once in his large, calloused hand before pocketing it. Then, instead of returning to his place, he walked directly to where Madeline stood frozen in disbelief. The crowd watched in silence as he pulled a clean handkerchief from his vest pocket and gently, carefully wiped the tears from her flushed cheeks. "Madam," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "no one deserves to be treated this way." He pressed the watch into her trembling hand, closing her fingers around it with his own. "This belongs with you and your child." Madeline stared up at him, her green eyes wide with confusion and gratitude. "Mr. Miller, I can't possibly—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "And you will." He tipped his hat slightly. "May I escort you home? This heat isn't good for you, or the little one." She hesitated only briefly before nodding, acutely aware of the stares following them as Maxwell offered his arm and led her away from the auction, away from the cruel laughter and prying eyes. The walk to Madeline's small house on the edge of town was silent. She lived in a modest one-room cabin that Thomas had built with his own hands, a place that had once felt full of promise, but now seemed to echo with emptiness. As they approached, Maxwell slowed his pace to accommodate her waddling gait. "Thank you," Madeline said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Maxwell shook his head. "There's nothing to repay, Mrs. Evans." "Madeline," she corrected softly. "Please." "Madeline," he repeated, testing the name. "I'm Maxwell. Most folks just call me Max." They reached her front door, and Madeline turned to face him properly. Now that they were away from the crowd, she could study him more closely. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered. His nose had clearly been broken at least once, and there were permanent lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting against the sun. But there was a kindness in those eyes that made her chest tighten. "Would you like to come in for some water?" she offered, suddenly reluctant to part from this stranger who had shown her more kindness in 5 minutes than she'd experienced in the 4 months since Thomas's death. Maxwell hesitated, glancing at the position of the sun in the sky. "I should get back to the ranch," he said finally, "but I'd be obliged if I could check on you in a day or two. Make sure you're getting on all right." Madeline nodded, clutching the pocket watch tightly. "I'd like that," she admitted. With the tip of his hat, Maxwell turned and walked back toward the center of town, where his horse was hitched outside the general store. Madeline watched him go, wondering what had compelled a man like that to intervene on her behalf. She had seen him around town occasionally, but had never spoken to him. Like most people in Willow Creek, she knew of his reputation as a fair employer and skilled horseman. But little else. Inside her small home, Madeline sat heavily on her only chair, finally allowing herself to examine the pocket watch. It was just as she remembered, gold-plated with Thomas's initials engraved on the back. She pressed the clasp, and it sprang open to reveal the timepiece within, still ticking steadily. A sob escaped her as she remembered Thomas proudly showing it to her when his father had given it to him. "He gave us back a piece of your papa," she whispered, rubbing her belly. The baby responded with a solid kick, as if in agreement. That night, as Madeline tried to find a comfortable position on her narrow bed, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Maxwell Miller's unexpected kindness. In a town that had all but forgotten her since Thomas's death, it was startling to be truly seen by someone. Even more startling was the warm feeling that had bloomed in her chest when he'd wiped away her tears with such gentle care. "Don't be foolish," she scolded herself in the darkness. The man was just being decent, nothing more. But as she drifted off to sleep, the memory of his deep voice saying her name followed her into her dreams. 2 days later, Maxwell made good on his promise to check on her. Madeline was hanging her few pieces of laundry on the line behind her house when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Shading her eyes against the bright morning sun, she watched as Maxwell dismounted from a magnificent chestnut gelding. "Morning, Mrs. Evans, Madeline," he corrected himself, leading his horse to the small water trough beside her well. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she replied, suddenly conscious of her faded dress and hair escaping from its bun. "Max?" he reminded her with a small smile that transformed his serious face. "I brought you something." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small burlap sack. "Fresh vegetables from the ranch garden. And there's a jar of preserves in there too, Blackberry. My housekeeper makes them." Madeline accepted the sack, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair streaked with the occasional silver strand. "How are you feeling? The baby giving you trouble?" "No more than usual," she said with a small laugh, then winced as the baby delivered a particularly strong kick. "Though he does seem to be practicing for a boxing match today." "He?" Maxwell raised an eyebrow. Madeline shrugged. "Just a feeling I have." She gestured toward her small house. Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer after your kindness. This time, Maxwell accepted. He tied his horse to the hitching post and followed her inside. The cabin was small but meticulously clean, with a few simple decorations that spoke of Madeline's efforts to make it a home. A colorful quilt draped over the bed in the corner, and dried wildflowers hung from the ceiling beams. Maxwell sat at her small table while Madeline prepared coffee on her wood stove. As she moved around the tiny kitchen, she was acutely aware of his presence, how he seemed to fill the space with his quiet strength. "Have you thought about what you'll do after the baby comes?" Maxwell asked, as she set a steaming cup before him. Madeline sat across from him, cradling her own cup between her hands. "I've been taking in mending," she said, "and Mrs. Patterson at the hotel sometimes needs help with laundry. It's not much, but it's something." Maxwell nodded thoughtfully. "Winter will be here before you know it." "I know." Madeline looked down at her coffee, not wanting him to see the worry in her eyes. The thought of facing the harsh Montana winter alone with a newborn kept her awake at night. "We'll manage." "I'm sure you will," Maxwell said, his tone suggesting he believed in her strength. "But everyone needs help sometimes." "Is that why you helped me at the auction?" she asked, finally voicing the question that had been on her mind. "Because you thought I needed help?" Maxwell considered her question for a moment. "Partly," he admitted. "But mostly because what those people were doing wasn't right. Mocking a woman in your condition." He shook his head, a flash of anger crossing his features before he controlled it. "It wasn't right." "No," Madeline agreed softly. "It wasn't. But I've learned that people's kindness often runs out when misfortune lingers too long." "Not mine," Maxwell said simply, meeting her gaze with such sincerity that Madeline had to look away. They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing more easily than Madeline would have expected. Maxwell told her about his ranch, how he'd built it from nothing after coming west 10 years ago. He spoke of his horses with pride and affection, describing the breeding program he'd established that was beginning to gain recognition beyond Montana territory. In turn, Madeline shared stories of her life before Willow Creek growing up in Boston, meeting Thomas when he came east to study engineering, their journey west when the mining company had offered him work. She found herself telling Maxwell things she hadn't spoken of to anyone, her fears about raising a child alone, her anger at Thomas for leaving her, though she knew the mine collapse wasn't his fault, her determination to give her child a good life despite everything. When Maxwell finally rose to leave, the sun was high in the sky. "I've taken up too much of your morning," he said apologetically. "Not at all," Madeline assured him. "It's been nice to have company." Maxwell hesitated at the door. "I have business in town again next week. Would it be all right if I stopped by?" "I'd like that," Madeline said, surprised by how much she meant it. Over the next few weeks, Maxwell's visits became a regular occurrence. Sometimes he brought practical gifts: firewood, food from his ranch, a rocking chair he claimed was taking up space in his storage room. Other times he simply brought his company, which Madeline found herself looking forward to more than she cared to admit. As August turned to September, Madeline's time grew closer. Her movements became more labored, her nights more uncomfortable. Maxwell noticed and began stopping by every other day, often bringing one of his ranch hands to help with chores she could no longer manage easily: chopping wood, drawing water from the well, preparing her home for the coming winter. The town noticed these visits, of course. Gossip spread quickly in Willow Creek. Some of it was unkind suggestions that Madeline had set her cap for the wealthy rancher before her husband was even cold in his grave. But there were others who saw the situation more clearly: a decent man helping a woman in need, with no expectations beyond the satisfaction of doing right. Madeline heard the whispers when she ventured into town for supplies, but she found she cared less than she might have expected. Maxwell's friendship had given her back something she'd lost after Thomas's death, a sense that she wasn't alone in the world. One crisp September evening, as the first hints of autumn colored the cottonwood trees along the creek, Maxwell arrived at Madeline's cabin to find her grimacing in pain, one hand pressed against her lower back. "It's nothing," she assured him when she saw his concerned expression. "Just practice pains," the midwife says. "They've been coming and going for days." Maxwell wasn't convinced. "How far apart are they?" Madeline blinked in surprise. "How would you know to ask that?" A shadow passed over his face. "I was married once," he said quietly. "A long time ago." It was the first time he'd mentioned a wife, and Madeline was momentarily stunned into silence. Before she could ask more, a stronger pain gripped her, causing her to gasp and reach for the edge of the table. Maxwell was at her side instantly. "That wasn't just practice," he said firmly. "I'm fetching Mrs. Holloway." Mrs. Holloway was the town's midwife, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years' experience bringing babies into the world. Maxwell helped Madeline to her bed, then hurried to saddle his horse. The sun was setting as he galloped toward town, his mind racing with memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Sarah. Her name had been Sarah, and she'd died bringing their son into the world. The boy had followed shortly after, too small and weak to survive without his mother. Maxwell had buried them together on a hillside in Colorado, then sold everything he owned and headed north, determined to outrun his grief. He pushed the memories away as he reached Mrs. Holloway's house on the edge of town. The midwife took one look at his face and began gathering her supplies without question. "How far apart are the pains?" she asked as she threw a shawl around her shoulders. "I don't know exactly, but close enough that I'm worried," Maxwell replied. "Can you ride behind me? It'll be faster than hitching up your wagon." Mrs. Holloway, despite being in her 60s, nodded briskly. "Help me up then. No time to waste if this baby's coming early." The ride back to Madeline's cabin seemed to take an eternity, though in reality it was less than 20 minutes. When they arrived, they found Madeline pacing the small room, one hand braced against her back, the other cradling her belly. "Well now, Mrs. Evans," Mrs. Holloway said as she dismounted with Maxwell's help. "Let's see if this little one is ready to meet the world." Maxwell stood awkwardly by the door, suddenly unsure of his place. "I should go," he said, though the thought of riding back to his ranch and leaving Madeline made his stomach clench with anxiety. Mrs. Holloway gave him an appraising look. "You'll do no such thing," she said firmly. "Saddle up and fetch Dr. Carson. Then come back here and build up the fire." "I'll need plenty of hot water." Relief flooded through him at having a purpose. "Yes, madam." The next few hours passed in a blur. Maxwell rode to town and back with the doctor, then found himself relegated to the small porch outside Madeline's cabin, where he paced nervously, wincing at each cry that came from within. Dr. Carson emerged briefly to ask for more hot water, his expression giving nothing away. "Is she all right?" Maxwell asked, unable to keep the fear from his voice. The doctor eyed him curiously. "She's doing as well as can be expected. First babies often take their time." As night deepened, Maxwell built a fire in the yard to keep warm. He couldn't have said why it was so important to him to stay, only that the thought of leaving was unbearable. When Mrs. Holloway came out to stretch her legs around midnight, she found him still there, staring into the flames. "You care for her?" the midwife observed. It wasn't a question. Maxwell looked up, his face revealing more than he intended. "Is that so strange?" Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "Not strange at all. She's a good woman who's had more than her share of hardship." She studied him for a moment. "You've known loss too, I think." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Well," Mrs. Holloway said with a small smile, "new life has a way of healing old wounds, if we let it." She turned back toward the cabin. Won't be long now. The baby's turned properly, and she's nearly ready to push. Maxwell resumed his pacing, each minute stretching impossibly long. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when a new sound cut through the night, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn taking its first breath. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The cry continued, strong and insistent, the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Minutes later, the cabin door opened and Dr. Carson emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "Congratulations," he said with a tired smile. "Mrs. Evans has a healthy daughter." "A girl?" Maxwell asked, his voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded. "A fine, strong girl with a good set of lungs." He clapped Maxwell on the shoulder. "Mrs. Holloway is getting them both settled. You can go in soon." When Maxwell was finally allowed inside, the sun had risen fully, bathing the small cabin in golden light. Madeline lay propped up in bed, her face pale but radiant as she gazed down at the tiny bundle in her arms. Her hair had come loose from its usual neat bun, flowing over her shoulders like a copper waterfall. She looked up as he entered, her exhausted smile making his heart skip a beat. "Max," she said softly, "meet Margaret Rose Evans." He approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid he might somehow disturb the fragile peace of the moment. The baby was impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair, Thomas's hair he assumed, and pink cheeks still scrunched from the effort of being born. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like her mother." Madeline's cheeks flushed at the compliment. "Would you like to hold her?" Maxwell hesitated, suddenly terrified. "I don't know how." "It's not difficult," Madeline assured him. "Just support her head. Yes, like that." And then the baby was in his arms, a warm weight that seemed to anchor him to the earth in a way nothing had for years. Margaret opened her eyes blue, as all newborns were, and seemed to study him seriously before yawning and closing them again. "Hello, Margaret Rose," he whispered. "Welcome to the world." Mrs. Holloway, who had been tidying up the birthing supplies, exchanged a knowing look with Dr. Carson. "We'll be going now," she announced. "I'll be back this evening to check on you both. Mr. Miller, I assume you'll stay until then?" Maxwell nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from the baby's face. "I'll stay as long as I'm needed." After the doctor and midwife left, a peaceful quiet settled over the cabin. Madeline dozed while Maxwell sat in the rocking chair he'd given her, still holding Margaret. He studied the baby's tiny features, marveling at the perfect miniature fingernails, the delicate curve of her ears, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she slept. When Madeline awoke an hour later, she found him still there, still watching over her daughter with an expression of wonder. "You're good with her," she observed. Maxwell carefully returned Margaret to her mother's arms. "She makes it easy," he said. "She's a miracle." "Yes," Madeline agreed, adjusting her position to nurse the baby. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind since his revelation the previous evening. "Your wife. Did you have children with her?" Pain flickered across his face, but he didn't look away. "A son," he said quietly. "He died with his mother." "Oh, Max." Madeline reached out with her free hand and touched his arm. "I'm so sorry." He covered her hand with his own. "It was a long time ago. 8 years this December." "That doesn't make it any easier," she said gently. "No," he agreed. "But seeing you with Margaret, it's healing something I thought would stay broken forever." The simple honesty of his words brought tears to Madeline's eyes. For months, she'd been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day until her baby arrived, that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond that. Now, looking at Maxwell's face, at the tenderness and hope she saw there, she felt something stir within her that had been dormant since Thomas's death. Not quite love, not yet, but the possibility of it. "Will you tell me about her?" she asked. "Your wife?" Maxwell took a deep breath, then nodded. "Her name was Sarah," he began. "I met her in Denver." As Margaret nursed contentedly, Maxwell told Madeline about his first love, how they'd met when he was working as a farrier, how they'd married young and dreamed of starting a horse ranch together, how they'd scraped and saved for 3 years to buy their first piece of land. He spoke of Sarah's gentle nature, her love of music, her excitement when they learned she was expecting. "She was 7 months along when she started having pains," he said, his voice growing strained. "The doctor said the baby was coming too early, but there was nothing to be done about it. She fought so hard." He closed his eyes, the memory still sharp enough to cut. "She lived long enough to hold him once. We named him James, after my father." Madeline's tears fell freely now. "I can't imagine your grief." "I didn't handle it well," Maxwell admitted. "I couldn't stay there, where everything reminded me of them. I sold the land, packed what I could carry, and headed north. Ended up in Montana Territory almost by accident." He looked around the small cabin. "I never planned to put down roots again. Then I found a parcel of land that reminded me of what Sarah and I had dreamed of. Building the ranch gave me purpose, but I never thought I'd find—" "Find what?" Madeline prompted when he trailed off. Maxwell met her gaze directly. "A reason to open my heart again." The words hung between them, full of meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Madeline looked down at Margaret, who had fallen asleep at her breast, milk-drunk and peaceful. "I thought my life was over when Thomas died," she said finally. "I was so angry at him for leaving, at God for taking him, at myself for being left alone. Then I felt her move inside me for the first time, and I realized I couldn't give up." She looked up at Maxwell, allowing him to see the vulnerability in her eyes. "And then, you came along and showed me kindness when I needed it most." "It wasn't just kindness, Madeline," Maxwell said softly. "From the moment I saw you at that auction, something changed for me." Before she could respond, Margaret stirred and began to fuss. The intensity of the moment broke as Madeline shifted her attention to the baby, adjusting her swaddling and soothing her back to sleep. "You should rest," Maxwell said, standing. "I'll stay outside. Keep the fire going so you have hot water when you need it." Madeline nodded, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you, Max, for everything." He paused at the door. "I'll be right outside if you need anything. Anything at all." As autumn deepened into winter, Maxwell became a fixture in Madeline and Margaret's lives. He visited almost daily, bringing supplies, helping with chores, and spending hours simply sitting by the fire while Madeline nursed Margaret or rocked her to sleep. He hired a woman from town to help with cooking and cleaning 3 days a week, ignoring Madeline's protests that it was too much. "Let me do this," he said simply. "Please." The town's gossip had shifted from disapproval to speculation about when Maxwell Miller would make an honest woman of the widow Evans. It seemed obvious to everyone that the rancher was besotted with both mother and daughter. Everyone except Madeline herself, who found it difficult to believe that a man like Maxwell could truly be interested in a woman with another man's child. Yes, he was kind and attentive, and sometimes she caught him looking at her in a way that made her heart race. But she'd convinced herself it was friendship he sought. Nothing more. The first heavy snow came in early December, blanketing Willow Creek in white. Maxwell arrived at Madeline's cabin that morning with a sleigh instead of his usual horse, the bells on the harness jingling merrily. "Bundle up, Margaret," he said with a grin that took years off his weathered face. "I'm taking you both to the ranch for the day. Mrs. Holloway says you need to get out of this cabin before you go stir crazy." Madeline laughed, surprised by the suggestion. Did she really say that? "Well, not in those exact words," Maxwell admitted, "but she did say it would do you good to have a change of scenery. And I've been wanting to show you the ranch," The thought of seeing where Maxwell lived, of understanding more about the life he'd built, was too tempting to resist. Madeline wrapped Margaret in layers of blankets and allowed Maxwell to help them both into the sleigh, tucking thick fur robes around their legs to keep out the cold. The ride to Ranch took nearly an hour, the sleigh gliding smoothly over the snow-covered road. Madeline gasped when they crested the final hill, and the ranch spread out before them, a collection of well-built structures nestled in a protected valley, with mountains rising majestically beyond. "Max, it's beautiful," she breathed. Pride touched his features as he guided the horses down the slope. "It's taken 10 years to build it to this point." The main house was larger than Madeline had expected, constructed of solid logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney, and as they drew closer, the front door opened to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman in an apron. "Mrs. Perkins," Maxwell called as he brought the sleigh to a stop. "We have guests." "So I see," the woman replied with a warm smile. "And high time too. This house needs a woman's touch and a baby's laughter." Maxwell's ears reddened at the comment as he helped Madeline and Margaret from the sleigh. "Mrs. Perkins has been my housekeeper for 7 years," he explained. "She's under the impression that gives her the right to speak her mind at all times." "And I'm always right, aren't I, Mr. Miller?" Mrs. Perkins countered good-naturedly. She turned to Madeline. "Come in, my dear, before you and that precious baby catch your death. I've got coffee brewing and fresh bread just out of the oven." The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, spacious rooms with simple but quality furnishings, polished wooden floors covered with colorful rugs, and a massive stone fireplace in the main living area. Yet despite its size and evident comfort, the house had an emptiness to it, as if it were waiting for something or someone to make it truly a home. "It's lovely," Madeline said, unwrapping Margaret as the warmth of the house enveloped them. Maxwell took their coats, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "I'll give you the full tour after you've had something to eat." In the large kitchen, Mrs. Perkins had prepared a feast: fresh bread, stew that had been simmering all morning, apple pie still warm from the oven. As they ate, the housekeeper entertained Madeline with stories of the ranch's early days, when Maxwell had lived in a one-room cabin while building the main house. "Stubborn as they come," Mrs. Perkins said fondly. "Wouldn't hire proper help at first. Insisted on doing everything himself." "I didn't have the money for proper help," Maxwell protested. Mrs. Perkins snorted. "Pride, that's what it was. Still is." She winked at Madeline. "But he's learning. Slowly." After the meal, Maxwell took Madeline on a tour of the ranch. Margaret was content to stay with Mrs. Perkins, who clearly adored babies and had produced a basket of soft toys seemingly from nowhere. The ranch was impressive stables housing Maxwell's prized horses, a blacksmith shop where he still occasionally worked himself, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, and fields that would be full of grazing horses come spring. Maxwell spoke about each aspect with quiet pride, but it was when they reached the stables that his passion truly showed. "This is Thundercloud," he said, stopping before a stall housing a magnificent black stallion. "He's the foundation of my breeding program. From his line, I've developed horses known for their strength, speed, and temperament." The stallion approached cautiously, his nostrils flaring as he scented Madeline. She stood still, allowing the horse to become comfortable with her presence. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "He knows it too," Maxwell said with a chuckle. "Vainest creature I've ever met." He reached into his pocket and produced an apple, which Thundercloud accepted with surprising delicacy. As they walked through the stables, Maxwell introduced each horse by name, describing their lineage and special qualities. Madeline was struck by the gentleness in his voice as he spoke to the animals, the same tenderness she'd observed when he held Margaret. "You really love them," she observed. Maxwell nodded. "They saved me, in a way. After Sarah and James died, Caring for horses gave me a reason to get up each morning. He ran a hand along the neck of a chestnut mare. They don't judge or expect anything beyond care and respect. Unlike people, Madeline said with understanding. Unlike people, he agreed. Then he turned to face her fully. Until you. You've never expected anything from me, Madeline. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. That's not entirely true, she admitted. I've come to expect your visits. I miss you when you don't come. Maxwell took a step closer. Do you? Yes, she whispered. For a moment, it seemed he might close the distance between them, but the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. One of the ranch hands appeared at the stable door, apologizing for the interruption, but needing Maxwell's input on an urgent matter with one of the pregnant mares. The rest of the day passed pleasantly, if less intimately. Maxwell showed Madeline the rest of the property, including a small apple orchard he was cultivating, and the creek that gave the ranch a reliable water source year-round. By late afternoon, Margaret was growing fussy, and Maxwell suggested they head back to town before the light faded. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Perkins pressed a basket of food into Madeline's hands. Enough for several days, she said firmly, and I expect to see you both again soon. The ride back to Willow Creek was quieter, with Margaret sleeping soundly in Madeline's arms and both adults lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Madeline's cabin, Maxwell finally broke the silence. I'd like to build an addition to your house, he said abruptly. Before spring. Margaret will need her own room eventually, and the kitchen is too small for practical use. Madeline stared at him in surprise. Max, that's too much. You've already done so much for us. He brought the sleigh to a stop in front of her cabin. It's not enough, he said, his voice low and intense. Not nearly enough. Why? She asked, needing to understand. Why do you care so much about us? Maxwell took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. Because when I'm with you and Margaret, I feel like I'm home, he said simply. And I want you to have a home worthy of you both. Tears pricked at Madeline's eyes. We already have that, she said softly. This cabin was Thomas's gift to me, his promise of a future together. I can't just let you replace it. Pain flickered across Maxwell's face at the mention of Thomas, but he nodded slowly. I understand, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't. Not really. I wouldn't want to erase him from your life. Or Margaret's. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the occasional jingle of the harness bells as the horses shifted restlessly. What if, Madeline said carefully, what if it wasn't an addition, but improvements? A better roof? Proper windows? A larger stove? She looked up at him. Thomas would have wanted Margaret to be warm and comfortable. He would have done those things himself if he'd lived. Relief washed over Maxwell's features. Improvements, he agreed. I can work with that. As he helped her from the sleigh, his hand lingered on hers longer than necessary. Madeline, he began, then hesitated. I don't want to rush you. I know it's not been a year since Thomas passed. But I hope you know that my feelings for you and Margaret go beyond friendship. Madeline's heart hammered in her chest. I think I do know that, she said quietly. And it frightens me. Why? He asked, his brow furrowing. Because I'm beginning to care for you too, she admitted. And that feels like a betrayal of Thomas. Maxwell's expression softened. Loving again doesn't diminish what you had with him, he said gently. I'll never try to replace Thomas in your heart or in Margaret's life. But I hope, in time, you might find room for me too. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and respectful that Madeline felt tears threatening again. Good night, Madeline, he said. Thank you for today. Good night, Max, she whispered. As promised, Maxwell began work on improving Madeline's cabin as soon as the weather permitted. He hired the town's best carpenter to replace the leaking roof and install proper glass windows in place of the oiled paper that had barely kept out the winter chill. The old stove was removed and a new, larger one installed, capable of heating the entire cabin evenly. Each improvement was discussed with Madeline first, with Maxwell careful to respect her wishes and Thomas's original design. By February, the cabin was transformed, still recognizably the home Thomas had built, but warmer, sturdier, more comfortable for a woman raising a child alone. Except Madeline wasn't truly alone anymore. Maxwell's daily visits continued, and gradually, the nature of their relationship began to shift. Sometimes their hands would touch as they both reached for Margaret, and neither would pull away immediately. Maxwell began staying for supper more often, and occasionally, when the evening grew late, Madeline would find the courage to ask him to read aloud from one of the books he'd brought her. On those evenings, with Margaret sleeping peacefully in her cradle and the fire crackling in the stove, Madeline could almost imagine a future she hadn't dared hope for, a life where she and her daughter were part of a family again. The town noticed the developing relationship, of course. Some still clucked their tongues at the perceived impropriety of a widow with a newborn forming an attachment so soon after her husband's death. But others, particularly those who had witnessed Maxwell's quiet devotion over the months, saw it differently. "That man worships the ground she walks on," Mrs. Holloway declared to anyone who would listen, "and that baby girl needs a father. What's improper about that?" By March, as the first signs of spring began to appear in Willow Creek, Maxwell had become so integrated into Madeline and Margaret's daily life that his absence was more noteworthy than his presence. When he announced he needed to travel to Denver on business for 2 weeks, Madeline was surprised by the sharp disappointment she felt. "It's a horse auction," he explained, as they sat by the fire the evening before his departure. "There's a stallion being sold that could bring new bloodlines to my breeding program." "Of course," Madeline said, trying to sound supportive despite the hollow feeling in her chest. "It's an important opportunity for the ranch." Maxwell studied her face in the firelight. "I'll miss you," he said softly. "Both of you." Margaret, now 3 months old and growing plumper by the day, gurgled happily from her place on a blanket near the fire, seemingly aware she was being discussed. "We'll miss you too," Madeline admitted, allowing herself to meet his gaze directly. "The days will seem very long without your visits." Something shifted in Maxwell's expression, a decision being made. Perhaps? He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not sure there is a right moment, but I can't leave tomorrow without asking." Madeline's breath caught as he opened the pouch and tipped a ring into his palm, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "I know it soon," Maxwell said, the words tumbling out as if he feared losing his nerve. "I know you're still healing, still finding your way as Margaret's mother. But I love you, Madeline. I love you both. And if you could see your way to giving me a chance to be a husband to you and a father to Margaret, I swear I would spend every day of my life trying to deserve that honor." Tears filled Madeline's eyes, not of sadness but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Max," she whispered, her voice failing her. "You don't need to answer now," he hastened to add. "I'll be gone for 2 weeks. That will give you time to think, to be sure. If the answer is no, I'll understand. I'll still be your friend, still help however I can with Margaret." Madeline shook her head, finding her voice at last. "I don't need 2 weeks," she said, a smile breaking through her tears. "I've had months of watching you, of seeing the man you truly are." She reached out and touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers. "I love you too, Maxwell Miller. And yes, I will marry you." The look of stunned joy on his face was something Madeline knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then drew her into his arms for their first kiss. gentle at first, then deepening as she responded with all the love and hope that had been growing in her heart. When they finally parted, both breathless, Maxwell rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find this again," he murmured. "Never thought I'd want to." "Nor did I," Madeline admitted. "After Thomas died, I closed that part of myself off. I thought all I had left was Margaret. And now?" She smiled, touching the pearl on her finger. "Now I know life can give second chances, if we're brave enough to take them." Maxwell left for Denver the next morning as planned, but with a lightness in his step and the promise of a future brighter than he'd dared to imagine. Madeline walked through the following days in a happy daze, admiring the pearl ring on her finger and making plans for a life she hadn't believed possible 6 months earlier. Mrs. Holloway was the first person she told about the engagement, and the midwife's delight was so genuine that Madeline found herself enveloped in a rare hug from the normally reserved woman. "I knew it from the moment he wiped your tears at that auction," Mrs. Holloway declared. "That man was smitten, even if he didn't know it yet." The news spread quickly through Willow Creek. Most reactions were positive congratulations, well wishes, offers to help with wedding preparations. But there were still those who disapproved, who thought Madeline was being disrespectful to Thomas's memory. One afternoon, while shopping at the general store with Margaret strapped to her chest in a sling, Madeline overheard two women whispering behind the dry goods shelf. "Not even a year since poor Thomas was killed," one said, "and already she's wearing another man's ring. And that baby not even baptized with her father's name yet," the other added. "It's shameful, that's what it is." Madeline felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment and anger warring within her. Before she could decide whether to confront them or simply leave, another voice joined the conversation: Mrs. Patterson, the hotel owner's wife, who had occasionally hired Madeline for laundry work. "What's shameful," Mrs. Patterson said loudly, "is two grown women with nothing better to do than criticize a young widow who's found happiness after tragedy. If Thomas Evans were here, he'd thank God that his wife and daughter are being cared for by a good man." The whispering women fell silent, chastened by Mrs. Patterson's rebuke. Madeline caught the older woman's eye and mouthed a silent "thank you," receiving a firm nod in return. That evening, as Madeline rocked Margaret to sleep, she found herself talking to Thomas as she sometimes did when she was alone. "I hope Mrs. Patterson is right," she whispered. "I hope you would understand, would be happy for us." She looked down at Margaret's peaceful face, so like her father's in the shape of her nose and chin. "She'll know about you, I promise. She'll know how much you wanted her, how you would have loved her if you'd had the chance." A sense of peace settled over her as she placed Margaret in her cradle. For the first time since agreeing to marry Maxwell, she felt completely certain she was making the right choice not just for herself, but for her daughter, and for the memory of her first love. The 2 weeks of Maxwell's absence seemed to crawl by, but finally the day of his expected return arrived. Madeline spent the morning making his favorite apple pie and tidying the cabin, her excitement growing with each passing hour. Margaret, sensing her mother's mood, was particularly cheerful, babbling and smiling as Madeline spoke to her about the life they would soon have with Maxwell. By mid-afternoon, when he still hadn't appeared, Madeline began to worry. The stage from Denver should have arrived in Willow Creek by noon. She tried to distract herself with chores, but her eyes kept straying to the window, watching for his familiar figure on the road. As dusk approached, Madeline was nearly frantic with worry. She bundled Margaret up against the early spring chill and walked to the edge of town, where she could see the road leading from the direction of the stagecoach stop. The street was quiet, with most people already home for supper. Just as she was about to turn back, she spotted a figure in the distance, a man on horseback, moving slowly toward town. Even from a distance, she recognized Maxwell's broad shoulders and the distinctive way he sat a horse. Relief flooded through her. followed immediately by concern at his slow pace. As he drew closer, she could see that he was slumped slightly in the saddle, and the horse he rode wasn't one of his own, but a rented mount. When he finally reached her, the reason for his delayed return became clear. His left arm was in a sling, and a large bruise discolored one side of his face. "Max!" she gasped. "What happened?" He dismounted carefully, wincing as the movement jostled his injured arm. Despite his obvious pain, his face lit up at the sight of her and Margaret. "Nothing serious," he assured her, bending to kiss her softly. "Just a disagreement with some fellows who thought they could cheat at cards." "You were in a fight?" Madeline asked, shocked. In all the months she'd known him, Maxwell had never shown a violent tendency. "Not by choice," he said grimly. "I was minding my own business at the hotel when 3 men decided my money looked better in their pockets. When I called out their cheating, they followed me outside." His expression darkened. "They had knives. I was lucky to get away with just a broken arm and some bruises." Madeline felt ill at the thought of how much worse it could have been. "Where's your stallion? Did you get him?" Maxwell's face brightened. "I did. He's magnificent. Madeline, just what the ranch needs. He's being transported separately with a handler I hired. Should arrive next week." He touched her cheek gently. "I'm sorry I worried you. The doctor in Denver insisted I rest for a few days before traveling, or I would have been home sooner." "You're home now," Madeline said softly. "That's what matters." Despite his injuries, Maxwell insisted on walking Madeline and Margaret back to the cabin. Once there, he collapsed into the rocking chair with a grateful sigh while Madeline prepared a plate of food for him. "The doctor says the arm will heal cleanly," he told her as he ate. 6 weeks in the sling, then it should be good as new." 6 weeks!" Madeline exclaimed. "How will you manage the ranch?" Maxwell smiled. "That's actually something I wanted to discuss with you. I was thinking—" He hesitated, suddenly looking uncertain. "I was thinking we might move up the wedding. As soon as possible, in fact." Madeline blinked in surprise. "Because of your arm?" "Partly," he admitted. "I could use your help at the ranch while I'm healing. But mostly because I don't want to wait any longer to make you my wife." He set his plate aside and reached for her hand with his good one. "Nearly losing my life in that alley in Denver made me realize how precious time is. I don't want to waste another day." Madeline's heart raced at the urgency in his voice. "How soon were you thinking?" "Next week?" he suggested. "We could have a simple ceremony at the church, with just a few friends present. Mrs. Perkins is already planning a celebration dinner afterward." He grinned sheepishly. "I might have told her you said yes before I left." Madeline laughed, feeling lighter than she had in days. "You were that confident?" "Hopeful," he corrected. "More hopeful than I've been in years." She looked down at Margaret, now asleep in her cradle, then back at Maxwell with his bruised face and bandaged arm, this man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness at an auction. "Next week sounds perfect," she said. They were married the following Saturday in Willow Creek's small church, with Mrs. Holloway, Dr. Carson, and a dozen other friends in attendance. Madeline wore a new blue dress that Maxwell had insisted on buying for her, with Margaret's christening gown, a gift from Mrs. Perkins, serving as something new for the baby. The ceremony was brief but deeply moving. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Maxwell kissed Madeline with such tenderness that several of the women present dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The celebration afterward at the Ranch was a joyous affair. Mrs. Perkins had outdone herself with the food, and several of the ranch hands had decorated the main house with early spring flowers. Maxwell had arranged for a fiddler from town to provide music, and despite his injured arm, he managed a slow dance with his new bride, Margaret cradled between them. As the evening wore on, Madeline found herself standing on the porch, gazing out at the land that was now her home. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She felt Maxwell's presence before she heard him, a warmth at her back that had become familiar and essential. "Happy?" he asked, slipping his good arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, leaning back against his chest. "I've been thinking," Maxwell said, his breath warm against her ear. "Margaret needs a proper middle name." Madeline turned in his arms, surprised. "She has one. Rose." "I know," he said, "but I thought perhaps we might add to it. Margaret Rose, Sarah Evans Miller." He watched her face carefully. "If that's all right with you." Tears sprang to Madeline's eyes at the gesture, this acknowledgement of the woman he had loved and lost, this joining of their past sorrows with their present joy. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." "There's something else," Maxwell continued, his expression growing serious. "I'd like Margaret to know about Thomas when she's older, what kind of man he was, how much he wanted her. And I'd like her to know about Sarah and James, too." "Of course," Madeline agreed immediately. "They're part of who we are, part of what brought us together." Maxwell nodded, relief evident in his features. "I've spent so many years trying not to remember, trying to outrun grief. But loving you and Margaret has taught me that remembering can be a blessing, too." Madeline reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Thomas once told me that love isn't a finite resource that the heart expands to hold what it needs to hold." She smiled through her tears. "He was right. A wise man," Maxwell said softly. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Madeline said with certainty. "He always said I deserved someone who would look at me like I hung the moon and stars." Maxwell's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. "Well, I've been told I'm not subtle about my feelings for you." "No," she agreed with a laugh. "You're not." From inside the house came the sound of Margaret's hungry cry, a reminder of the responsibilities and joys that awaited them. Madeline started to turn toward the door, but Maxwell held her for one moment more. "I made a promise to myself that day at the auction," he said quietly. "When I saw you standing there with tears on your face, being mocked for something no one should ever be mocked for: grief, expectation, hope. I promised that if I could help it, you would never feel that alone again." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I intend to keep that promise, Madeline. Every day, for the rest of our lives." Madeline's heart swelled with love for this man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and offered not pity, but respect, not charity, but partnership. "I believe you will," she said, "and I promise to remind you every day that you deserve happiness too." They sealed the promise with a kiss as the last light of day faded from the sky, the first stars appearing overhead like witnesses to this new beginning built on the ashes of old sorrows. As they turned to go inside to their daughter, Madeline felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death. The future stretched before them, not perfect, not without challenges, but full of possibilities, and the kind of love that grows stronger with each passing day. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening much like the one when they first met, Madeline sat on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Maxwell teach 5-year-old Margaret how to brush Thundercloud's gleaming coat. Beside her, in a handmade cradle, their 3-month-old son Michael slept peacefully, his tiny fist curled around a finger of the worn gold pocket watch that would someday be his. Margaret's laughter rang out across the yard as Thundercloud nuzzled her palm for an apple, and Maxwell looked up to meet Madeline's gaze, his smile as bright and true as it had been on their wedding day. In that moment, with the sun setting behind the mountains and her family before her, Madeline remembered the auction where it all began, the mockery, the tears, the unexpected kindness that had changed everything. The memory no longer brought pain, only gratitude for the man who had seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself, who had wiped away her tears and, in doing so, shown her that life could begin again when you least expected it. As if reading her thoughts, Maxwell lifted their daughter onto his shoulders and walked toward the porch, his eyes never leaving Madeline's face. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Miller?" he asked, setting Margaret down to run inside for her evening milk. "The day we met," Madeline replied honestly. "How different life would be if you hadn't been there." Maxwell sat beside her, reaching for her hand as naturally as breathing. "I like to think we would have found each other somehow," he said. "Some things are just meant to be." Madeline rested her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that whatever struggles lay ahead, they would face them together, this family forged from loss and hope, from tears wiped away and promises kept. "Yes," she agreed, her heart full. "Some things are meant to be."